So we are recording.
Yeah.
And
Did you want me to share my screen? That way I can just do the slides?
yeah,
Okay.
because it says one participant can share at a time.
All right.
So all this is going to go away when Julian shares his screen.
All right. Should I get to it?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all for inviting me here. I get to be on lots of Zoom calls with Debbie and some other folks here on the call to talk water all the time. So when she asked me if I wanted to nerd out about water on a Saturday, I said, of course. So I'm going to talk about two different topics today. One is tribal water infrastructure issues, and one is the Supreme Court case Sackett versus EPA from earlier this year, and kind of what the impacts of that case are right now. So let me share my screen here. Let's see if this works. All right.
We see you. All you gotta do there. Yes.
Better? Okay.
At best. That's best. That's excellent.
All right.
You get an A+.
Thank you. I strive for A+, even though I never got them. Okay. Just grabbing my notes here. Okay, cool. So I work for EarthJustice here in Washington, D.C. I work on a lot of different water policy issues, cleaning rivers and streams, lead in drinking water, like Debbie was talking about, water infrastructure, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm a lobbyist, but I don't only do lobbying, if that makes sense. Like I talk to people on the Hill here in DC a lot, but I also work with people like all of you from different communities who are interested in these issues to see how we can work together and convince these oddballs here in DC to do the right thing every once in a while. So that's kind of my background. I've been working on water for a couple of years now at EarthJustice, and before that at another organization called Green Latinos. So these two issues that you're going to hear about today are really issues that are important for everyone and issues that I work on a lot with EarthJustice. EarthJustice is a law firm, so our main role in the environmental movement is lawsuits. We represent community members, community organizations, and other environmental groups for free in environmental lawsuits to try to protect people and places and things like that. So I'll talk a little bit more about how that relates to these issues that we work on a lot here in DC as well, in addition to those lawsuits. So tribal water infrastructure issues, I'm going to go a little fast through this, and then we can maybe do some questions after that, and then I can do the second part about Sackett versus EPA, or do you want...
We want people to write questions in the chat.
Okay.
And Doris and Susan or Gloria or me can read them out loud and have a discussion that way. That's the way we do it here at Water Sentinels.
Okay. Do you want me to go through both of them and then we do the questions?
No.
One questions.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. All right. So just an overview here. You don't have to read everything on the slide, but there's some pretty jarring statistics about the state of tribal water infrastructure around the country. If y'all have ever read about water infrastructure generally, just for anybody, for the whole country, it's not great. A lot of our infrastructure, even in communities that have money, are really outdated. Pipes are old. Wastewater treatment plants and drinking water pumping stations. A lot of these things were built a long time ago, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and they've outlived their expected lifespan. It's like we have our water infrastructure is like a car from the 70s that people are still trying to drive or something. It's really bad news. And because there's less investment from the federal government, a lot of communities have no choice but to kind of just live with whatever crappy water infrastructure that they have. And in tribes, in tribal communities and in reservations, it's even worse. You can see this first stat, which is insane to me every time I read it, that almost half of tribal homes don't have access to reliable water sources, clean drinking water, basic sanitation. The second one is even more crazy, that Native American households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. So you have these communities that are really facing some of the hugest, largest obstacles to accessing clean drinking water and clean wastewater and clean sanitation in the whole country. And that's one of the reasons during the COVID-19 pandemic, you saw a lot of people in tribal communities and reservations get COVID and have health complications and die from COVID at a rate much higher because there was no water for them to use before the vaccine. So it really is a crisis that has existed for a long time. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I figured I would throw this stuff in here in case folks want to research this a little bit later. But like, just a quick slide on history. Reservations were created for tribes. A lot of the times those tribes were forcibly relocated from one part of the country to another. Water rights. Tribes are supposed to have a very senior standing in terms of water rights, in terms of accessing water for their own uses compared to other uses. Unless a tribe expressly gave up their natural resources to the United States, then the reservation's natural resources should belong to the tribe. There was a Supreme Court case in the early 1900s about whether that includes water rights, and the Supreme Court back in 1908 said, yeah, it includes water rights. And that has been a fight for that to be more than just a decision on paper for over 100 years since then. So it really is an ongoing battle for them to get what they have been promised from the federal government. There's a special relationship that tribes have as sovereign nations to the federal government. And often the federal government does not hold up their end of the bargain for protecting those resources and providing those resources for tribes that they are owed by law. Here's some more stats that are crazy. Navajo Nation is the largest tribe in the country, and those folks are 67 times more likely than other Americans to live without access to running water. And it goes beyond just drinking water and wastewater. It's the schools as well, like Debbie mentioned with the lead. Like if you can't have clean water in a school, you can't have kids in a school. They're young, they're still developing. Even more so than adults, contaminated water is a danger to children, which we all know, right, intuitively. So what happens in reservations is those schools will close if they have contaminated water, which happens a lot of the time. So this slide is really to just hammer home that there's been a lot of failures on the part of our government to these communities, and we're trying to very slowly right the ship, but without recognizing that we can't move forward towards the solutions without recognizing the damage that has been done, in my opinion. So speaking of solutions, some of the obstacles to getting funding are also unique for tribes. And some of them are not. So local funding, for example, with the federal government investing less in water infrastructure over the last 50 years, not just tribes, but a lot of communities that don't have money have to rely on their state government or their city or their town to pay for water infrastructure upgrades. And a lot of these places don't have that kind of money. It's not the way water infrastructure was designed. It was designed to be funded by the federal government in a lot of cases, and then the federal government just backed out over the last few decades. So there are vehicles in through agencies like EPA and the Indian Health Service that do fund water infrastructure, including specifically for tribes, but those are usually really underfunded. Y'all may have heard of the state revolving funds. We're always fighting together with a lot of folks on this call and across the country to make sure that that fund has more money for everyone, including for tribes. Indian Health Service was fully funded thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law for the first time 2 years ago, for the first time ever. So that was actually some really good news during the pandemic that was really direly needed. And that'll help a lot of communities get better access to drinking water. And then this last thing down here, I wrote the O&M issue. O&M stands for operations and maintenance. So this is one of the biggest problems for tribes. And what it means is they can get funding sometimes to put in new water infrastructure, but it's not just paying for it to be put in, right? You have to maintain it. You have to have people in the community who know how to work this stuff, engineers and water system operators. And what happens is a lot of these funding streams, whether it's from the federal government or from states or from EPA or from other agencies, they don't fund operations and maintenance. So it's kind of setting up communities for a trap, right? If you put these new expensive water infrastructure systems in, and then in 5 years you don't have anybody to operate it or who knows how to fix it, and you don't have the money to pay for that, what is that community going to do, right? So that's one of the legislative fights that is going on right now, is to try to get not only more funding overall, but operations and maintenance funding. So that is the stuff in blue and orange here. There's a bill that's circulating in the Senate and the House that is about this exact issue. It's about filling in some gaps for federal agencies that have the ability to fund water infrastructure for tribes, and including funding operations and maintenance. So you can just Google it, the Tribal Access to Clean Water Act. It's really great. And the more we can spread the word about that and try to get members of Congress and the Senate to support that, the better. And then, if you all want to check out these slides later, there's a lot of really great resources to learn more about this, because this is a topic that hasn't really gotten the attention it deserves. And it's really complicated. Even for me, I'm very far from an expert on this issue, but there's lots of experts from tribal communities, lawyers from tribal communities who have written about this stuff. So definitely check this stuff out if you're interested more in that. So those are my slides on tribal water infrastructure. And before I switch gears to the next topic, I will stop there.
We're right on time.
Great.
We have
Well,
questions.
we do have some questions, and one was a question and a suggestion that the Clean Water Act, people have tried to update it regarding the jurisdictions, and it's never worked. And so, I think Sierra Club is trying to help with this, but the suggestion is that we should be ready when we have control of Congress again. We should be ready with a bill that can really clean up the jurisdiction under WOTUS. The next question.
And as I mentioned, the intermittent waters is a big question. The way the law was passed, Clean Water Act, is not perfectly clear. And that's why the Supreme Court ruled against us, but we should be ready to make it clear that does apply to intermittent waters.
That's the next topic. So we're going to get way more into that. So I'm happy you brought that up, Mark. That's a really good point.
The next question was about the Colorado ruling about tribal water rights. And the question is, why did that happen? Why was it ruled that these water rights were not allowed?
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that case. I heard about it, but I don't know the details on that. So I'd have to learn a little bit more and then get back to you. But that's a good question.
It is just fine if you do not know everything. None of us know everything at all. And The question from David Dow was about contaminated water on Cape Cod. What if tribal people want to fish in that water and it's not on their reservation? Do they have any rights to fish in contaminated water?
That's a really good question. And EPA is undergoing a rulemaking right now that relates to that question, not specifically to mercury and PFAS, but basically it's about a rule that provides a regulation that provides some guardrails for states to consider tribal uses when the states are setting their water quality standards, for example. And that's important because tribes can set their own water quality standards, right? Which means like if you fish a lot, if you're a tribe that fishes a lot and everybody in your community and your family, including kids, eat a lot of fish, you got to make sure that the standard for the water where the fish live is higher so that your fish don't get polluted and you don't eat polluted fish. But what if it's not on the reservation, right? That's the big question. So EPA right now is developing a regulation that sets some guardrails for states and makes them consider those exact things like tribal uses when they're setting their water quality standards. And it's something that tribes have been asking for a really long time. So it's actually pretty neat that EPA has finally gotten around to it. Better late than never. It's not finalized yet, so I don't know like if it's good or bad or how exactly it's gonna like the details of it, but I know they're looking at that stuff right now. So we'll cross our fingers and hopefully they can get at that because that's an important question.
Good. Well, if there is a comment period, we can tell our members to support that. So we'll try. How significant is the recent SCOTUS decision about the Navajos?
I'm not sure, Elaine. Hi, Elaine. I'm not sure how which SCOTUS decision that is. So
It's relevant to the again, the earlier question about
The Colorado.
tribal water rights.
Julian, it's related to the federal government's trust responsibilities, and it's kind of complicated, but it decided not in favor against the Navajos, and I didn't know how significant that could be, especially how extensive is this trust responsibility of the federal government, and did they fall really short here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. These slides on tribal water infrastructure is pretty much the extent of my like tribal law is like a gigantic glacier, and I just have like a little scoop of an ice cube like at the top.
Okay, thank you.
It's a good question though.
That's the end of the questions on this topic.
Okay, I will continue on then. Thank you guys.
Somebody has their hand raised.
Oh, yes. Hey, Sylvia.
Hey, how are you all? It's good to be here. For what it's worth, I can just share that in my experience with NEJAC, and I'm Sylvia Orduno. I'm sorry, I should do introductions first. I'm Sylvia Orduno. I'm a longtime community organizer with Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and with the People's Water Board Coalition. And so thank you all for getting this organized. I can tell you though that my experience on NEJAC when I had just finished serving a 7-year term at the end of August, and I was chair for the last 3 years. One of the things that we kept talking about on the council was, again, very much concern about the environmental justice issues connected with Indigenous water rights, especially where there has been problems with water quality, water insecurity, drought, contamination from mining, PFAS, a number of issues, right, that many of you have been describing here, but also that continue to be persistent problems, even with the water insecurity issues, right, and access and so on. One of the things that, for whatever it's worth, that I think I might just offer in information sharing is that there is a whole other stakeholder process where Indigenous people have councils and formal treaty processes with the federal government, including the EPA, and there are representatives to those spaces, and they're very much about trying to ensure not only just treaty rights, but basic needs rights, right? Making sure that people have what they need for survival, and so that they can continue to live out their lives through cultural practices and respect for land, water, and other elements as they practice, right? And so even as advocates, I had to learn that there's a, how do I say this? That there are already people that are engaged in that, right? And that as allies, as advocates, as people who want to be supportive of those issues, we have to be careful to not get in the way, not assume, and very much take cues from where the people that are in that fight want us to be or where they need us to be, and to not necessarily assume we know more than we do, even if it's coming from the best of places, the best of hearts. And so it's just something that I want to note, because I had to personally also take a step back in what I thought I wanted to help with, right, as I was coming to understand them. And so I think even as these conversations progress, it might be just something for you all to consider, as well as figuring out who are those other folks that might need to be engaged that are directly involved in those water issues, and figure out where it's best for us to position in support. So for whatever
So
that's worth, I
Sylvia
just wanted
has
to share
just
that.
recapped. Sylvia has just recapped curriculum, ideas, thoughts that our wildlands and wilderness team, in terms of how we help and work with people in the West who live on reservations and are Native Americans. So yes, Sylvia, you are correct.
Thank you for that, Sylvia. Matter of fact, since I have the slides, let me see here. So yeah, like there are people the experts on this are the people who live this, right? Like those are the people I've gotten my information from, and those are the best places to start when you want to learn more about this stuff. My favorite website is tribalcleanwater.org. It's a bunch of experts from different tribal communities who have written about this. There's short fact sheets, there's long reports on there, there's stories and anecdotes, and there's lots of great links on that website. And it's a great group of people that are sort of centered at the University of Colorado, and they talk about this stuff a lot. And I like, if you all wanted to like get them on one of these calls, they'd probably be really happy to join. So I would highly recommend checking out that website. And if you have the opportunity to meet folks who are going through this stuff, as with any issue, right? Like that's the best way to learn about it. So definitely encourage that. These slides is just like the highest level overview that is secondhand, just from me putting stuff on slides that I've learned from them, right? So better to just go straight to them. But until you do that, these slides might help a little teeny bit. So hopefully you can use them to find some other cool, helpful information. So thank you for that, Sylvia. All right, anything else, or should I get to this next part?
Well, I'm all for going to the next part.
All right, perfect. So Sackett versus the EPA was a terrible Supreme Court decision that happened earlier this year about what waters the Clean Water Act applies to, because the Clean Water Act itself was written back in the early 70s, and there's some parts of it that are a little vague, and EPA has helped answer that question, what waters it applies to, throughout the years. But a lot of industry lobbyists and corporate polluter lobbyists were not satisfied with the answers that EPA had developed throughout the years, so they constantly sue to try to get that definition of what waters the Clean Water Act applies to reduced. because if the Clean Water Act doesn't apply to as many waters and wetlands and streams, and that means they don't have to get permits to dredge and fill wetlands and streams, which is really good for developers who want to build real estate or farmers who want to fill in streams to create more farmland and things like that. This picture is of an ephemeral stream, which is somebody, I forget the person who asked about it, but basically it's a stream that doesn't run year round, but is still really important to the ecosystem and to the water sources and to the groundwater and to the wildlife and to the people who live in this area. And this is an example of one of the kind of waters that, because of this Supreme Court decision, do not have Clean Water Act protections anymore. So let me get into this in a little more detail. So basically, there was this, I mean, they're technically a family, but they really are just like a tool for industry litigants called the Sacketts. They've been in court over this issue along with their industry buddies for a couple decades now. And basically, they have a property in Idaho and they wanted to fill a wetland that was close to a lake called Priest Lake. And under old definitions of the Clean Water Act, you needed a permit. And then you can fill out your permit, get your permit from the Army Corps, and then you can, if the Army Corps says okay, you can fill it. But you need to go get that permission first, because you can't just go around filling wetlands that are important to lakes. That's the way the Clean Water Act was designed, because it recognized that if a wetland is near a lake, even if it's not touching the lake directly, they're scientifically connected through groundwater, through runoff, through the water cycle, right? We all seen the water cycle graphics when we were in like school, whether students or teachers. The Clean Water Act recognized that stuff back in the 70s. So this, these people, the Sacketts, never even got a permit. They never even applied for a permit. Like, they could have applied for a permit and probably gotten permission to do this properly, but they never did that. And it's this issue is really big for industry because it makes development easier. And once the Supreme Court got more conservative, they kind of teed it up so this issue could get back before the court, because it's been before the Supreme Court before in 2000s. And but the court was different then. The court now is much more conservative, so they kind of teed this up knowing that the Supreme Court would do exactly what it did, which is interpret the Clean Water Act really narrowly. And it said that basically adjacent wetlands, most adjacent wetlands will not count as jurisdictional under the Clean Water Act. Streams that don't flow for the entire year, that don't flow consistently, will not be covered under that part of the Clean Water Act. So it really took a hammer to an important part of the permitting scheme of the Clean Water Act, which is the dredge and fill permit program. So it was really bad news. It sucked. We all kind of saw it coming, and it was kind of just as bad as we expected it. So here's kind of the state of things now. This is a map from the EarthJustice website that I think is really helpful, but the key at the bottom is kind of confusing. Basically, if it's dark red, those are the states that have less protections now, right? Because if EPA doesn't protect the wetlands, then it becomes a question of how are your state protections for wetlands? Because that's what the industry litigants argued, which is like the Clean Water Act shouldn't apply to this. States should be the ones to decide how to protect those kind of wetlands that are beyond the scope of the Clean Water Act, or those streams beyond the scope of the Clean Water Act. And, you know, I'm just going to pick Texas. If there's anybody from Texas on the call, I'm sorry that your environmental regulations are not great, but we're working to try to make that better over time. But some states have rules, for example, that say your water regulations cannot be any stricter than whatever EPA's is. So when the Supreme Court says, hey, EPA, you got to weaken your regulations now, then by definitions, a lot of states automatically weaken as well. North Carolina, as soon as this decision came down, passed a law. They had good wetlands laws before, and they passed the law saying basically, well, regardless of what our previous laws were, you can't be stricter than EPA. So once this decision weakened EPA, North Carolina's passed their law, and now their wetlands are weaker. So like you're going to see some states that are very that have legislatures that are anti-environment begin to get into shenanigans like that. And even the states that have lighter colors like California and where I'm from, New York, those states have better state regulations, but they're still in trouble because the water flows everywhere, right? Like New York waters are not contained only to New York. They come from the surrounding states and they come from Canada. They, all water goes downstream. It doesn't care about borders. So that's the whole point of the Clean Water Act is you need EPA to be a backstop so that Colorado headwaters can't be polluted, screwing people who live further down the Colorado River in New Mexico. So it's really bad news. This is just some states that are in each category, so you can kind of see where your state lies. It's different. It's different in each state, and each state has different laws. And sometimes a state might have good laws, but no like money to actually administer them or enforce them. So it actually gets pretty nuanced and complicated. But this is the note. And if you just Google EarthJustice wetlands protections, this will come up if you want to take a look at this again. So what's next? EPA issued a rule basically reflecting the Supreme Court decision. There's not much they could do. So it pretty much said everything the Supreme Court decision said. There's going to be a lot of lawsuits. There was ongoing lawsuits. EarthJustice had a bunch of them before the Supreme Court decision, and before that EPA rule. A lot of those are going to continue. There's probably going to be a lot of new ones because, for example, now that there's weakened protections, you might see some companies just bulldoze some wetlands and challenge EPA to or dare EPA to, find them or take an enforcement action against them. And then organizations like EarthJustice will have to sue EPA and say you have to, or not sue EPA, sue states or EPA or the polluters themselves, depending on what's going on, to see how this rule applies. And then advocacy, right? Like these are the solutions. The main solution is Congress needs to fix this. There's no way around it. Right now, Congress is in no shape to fix this. Anything fixing this would be dead on arrival right now, probably next year, probably the year after that. So this is a long-term fight. We basically are working to make members of Congress aware that this is a problem, and the only way out of this is for Congress to fix it. And then in your individual states, there's a lot of advocacy that's already going on for states to try to fix it quicker. And if you're in some of those states like Texas or Oklahoma, it might take a lot longer because the state legislatures and the state agencies there are really not down with improving environmental protections. But if you're in a state like Arizona or New Mexico or Illinois or Washington or New York, there are a lot of states thinking right now, with mixes of activists and state legislators and state agencies about how they can try to mitigate the damage from this Supreme Court decision by passing new laws or passing new state regulations. So, depending on where you live, there are different ways to try to plug into that and see what's going on. And if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely encourage you to see what's going on in your state. And I know EarthJustice and the Clean Water for All Coalition is probably going to have more information to make that easier for people in the coming weeks and months, because right now it can be kind of tricky to figure out what exactly is happening at the state level if you're new to this issue. But hopefully we can work together and improve wetlands and stream protections in states and then in Congress as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention, this slide was actually supposed to be earlier. I kind of messed up. So this is a map of New Mexico from Amigos Bravos, a great nonprofit in southern New Mexico, and over 95% of the streams in New Mexico are those ephemeral streams that don't run for the whole year. So all this red is ephemeral streams that are now unprotected because 95% of the waters in the state don't run year round. That's gonna crush farming communities, tribal communities, towns, big and small, cities, upstream and downstream. And the state is rushing to work with advocates and experts to figure out how to create a new state program to protect and or to create a bill that would create a state program to permit these things so they're not unprotected, because they depended in New Mexico on EPA to do that stuff for years. EPA was the one who was handling these permits. So if you're a state legislature and you got a strapped budget and you got to worry about education budgets and public health budgets and other things, you're not going to spend money on a state program when EPA already does this. But now the EPA doesn't do this anymore because they can't because of the Supreme Court. Now you got to find funding to protect these waters, and you're competing with stuff like education. So it's really hard. But in the Southwest, where you have lots of these streams, it's a really big issue. So in a lot of places like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, you'll probably see some action for states to try to protect this because it's really dire in those places. So that's the end of my slides, but I'll keep them up in case folks have questions. I can read them in the chat. Let's see.
The first question is from Falmouth, Massachusetts, where saltwater estuaries are polluted with saltwater with nitrogen from septic tanks. And the proposed solution is sewering these watersheds. And the question is, could the Clean Water Act or could EPA provide grants to help these expensive sewage plants address this?
That is a fantastic question, and the answer is yes, they could. The problem, so there are some grants for that, but not as many as there needs to be. So one of the big advocacy efforts right now is to provide more funding for those kinds of grants. EPA is doing like a little bit of that, and the United States Department of Agriculture also has some grants for that. But like this problem doesn't like this all types of different parts of the country and rural communities from like Alaska to Puerto Rico to California to New York, like wherever you go. So there needs to be more grants to build new, better septic systems and to connect towns and people who are on septic systems to actual sewer systems. Because in a lot of places, when it rains, sewage just comes like into their backyard or out of the septic tank and into their basement and crazy stuff like that, especially in places like Navajo Nation, like we were talking about earlier.
So I can use this example when I talk about intended use plans and disadvantaged communities and SRF funds.
Yeah.
Elaine wants to give examples from Washington State about how states with good protections can still be in trouble. Elaine?
Yeah, so just yesterday I spoke with the wetlands expert in our State Department of Ecology. And I know that different states have different definitions of what a wetland is by the size or things. In Washington State, it turns out it's anything, and this is in writing apparently, anything bigger than a puddle. So if you're working at the state level, you want to know what your definition of a wetland is. She told me that 50% of our wetlands are no longer protected under this new rule, 50%. And so, Julian, you're absolutely right. They don't have money to do the permitting that's going to be required. And they're asking right now the governor's budget to fund it because they are completely understaffed. And they're going to have to pick up all of the permitting now for this 50% no longer protected. And what they're doing is a form of permitting. It's not actually called a permit. It's a lesser standard that doesn't require public notification. Now, if they can upgrade it to having it be at a permit stage, then at least the public would know what was going on. But then the public cannot do citizen suits, and so they can't sue. So even though Washington has great rules, there are still these little, details where the waters are definitely at risk.
That's really helpful to know, Elaine. I know EarthJustice has a Seattle office, and somebody from that office heard from a state legislature, I think a state legislator, about that exact thing. So that sort of thing is just happening, where people are just realizing, like, oh crap, like there's a gap here. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big, and even in the good states. So it's if that's what it's like in the good states, then it's going to be bad in the bad
That's
states.
why I wanted to say, because it's a good say. I also asked for a map, and we do not have a map. There's a national map that's out of date. So they're looking for funding to get an up-to-date map, which is also pretty important if you want to protect these waters.
Yeah, lots of nonprofits are looking into finding funding for those kind of maps as well. Like Amigos Bravos is looking to do more detailed maps for New Mexico, and I know EarthJustice is working with a couple different places to try to find more maps. So hopefully you'll see more of those. Mark, I see your hand up.
I wanted to share with everybody how the Clean Water Act got passed. I was a young man working downtown DC, an environmentalist with happened to be with the federal government, and about 8 of us said, "Hey, there's these people over here preparing a law to protect clean water for safe drinking, and over here they're doing it for fish and wildlife. Let's get them together." And we did. We got them into one room, and they both had their bills, and they passed it around and then combined them into one bill. And then Congress had to pass it because it had suddenly the majority of people in the country wanted to pass either for safe drinking or for fish and wildlife.
Yeah, it's really helpful. The Clean Water Act passed with flying colors. The president at the time wanted to veto it, but his veto was overridden by Congress because there was that much support. And even nowadays, like if you ask people about the Clean Water Act or protecting clean water, it's not a red or blue thing, rural, urban thing. Everybody understands that it's important, except for here in DC, unfortunately. So we have to work to kind of force their hand and change their mind, and just, we have to be loud together about these issues to let them know that they can't keep messing this stuff up. We depend on it.
We have more questions. Can changing an ephemeral stream to a perennial stream using beaver activity change how the stream is covered under the Clean Water Act? I mean, what can you do?
That's a really good question. And that's one of the things that I think the answer is maybe. And the thing that is scary to us at EarthJustice is that's the sort of question that is going to be the subject of legal battles. And because there is some gray area with Sackett, with how it was written, and there's a lot of clown courts out there with really, really stupid judges that probably shouldn't be judges, that are just waiting to interpret that question, for example, in a way that would exclude perennial streams if possible, or classify them as ephemeral still. So like, it's kind of up in the air. So we'll see.
I'm active with that in Maryland, bring the beavers back. And we have saved one stream already just by bringing the beavers back. The thing is that you have to do the study and do it in the right place. But frequently, actually, the beavers used to be there and you just bring them back. And then all of a sudden, you don't have a stormwater runoff problem anymore like you used to have. And incidentally, of course, you do get the Clean Water Act definitely applicable. But basically, it's the Sierra Club in general is supporting bring the beavers back. So what I recommend everybody do in your state is look at situations where there used to be beavers and it's a very important part of the natural ecosystem. Just bring them back if they used to be there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I got to get plugged into those efforts myself.
We have been asked, is there a Sierra Club effort to help chapters work on this issue of total loss of protection for these perennial streams? And I
I
don't
can
know
talk
the
about
answer.
that. Elaine and I, and even Beth Roach, are on calls that Julian mentioned about the Clean Water for All working on
Yeah.
this issue. And Carolyn's from Missouri. And on the last call, there was and I can't remember the name, Carolyn said that they were concerned about the way the law was written in Missouri. So they went in to talk to the regulators. And in the story that they told, they explained that they thought they were going to have to deal with some loose regulations, and the Missouri told them, no, we interpret these laws to be like this. And then they volunteered that farm interests had been in there wanting to make sure what they were going to do about ephemeral and intermittent. And the thing they love to talk about are ditches.